Hey guys, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be a slightly different video. Today I'm actually going to be rating your drafts. I've asked for drafts from Twitter, from some people who were gracious enough to share their drafts, and I've picked around 5 drafts here to actually have a look at. I've chosen specifically drafts that I felt were dramatically different. So if your drafts were not selected, obviously I think I would have already responded to you on Twitter with a reply as to how I feel about your draft. Or if you were selected, of course, we're just going to be looking at your draft here today. The first draft that we'll actually be looking at is going to be Rohit's draft. I actually met Rohit's earlier in real life this year. But the reason why his draft was selected is simply because it is quite out of the template in terms of this 4-4-2 setup having someone like Darwin inside. And what's so interesting is Darwin and Salah, of course, are two players featuring from teams that I think that we have specifically ignored in terms of Liverpool. I myself, in my most recent draft, have actually neglected Liverpool, and we'll have to see how we develop our expectations on them. Because, of course, if you go back a couple of years in terms of the Premier League, the core of the squad is still one of the elite teams in terms of chance creation and goal creation within the Premier League outside of Man City. So, of course, the rise of Arsenal is quite significant, Newcastle as well. Even teams like United and Brighton are clearly top offenses. But if Liverpool return to the norm, I can understand why we could slowly pivot towards Liverpool. But my question for Liverpool is I feel like they're the team that were least affected by some of the price changes this year, right? Salah actually had a very, very similar price as he's had in recent years. Trent actually got a price increase. When you look across the board in FPL, I think the landscape has shown that teams like Arsenal and United are more than good enough of holding up to the standard being set by Liverpool and City. City mostly just due to rotation, therefore you can't maximize points from a single City player, but the idea is still there. I just think right now you have so much more cheaper prices for some players playing from Arsenal, playing for Chelsea even, who could have a step up this year. Or if you can simply just look at a team like Brighton that were still relatively underpriced considering the level that they showed that they were able to have under Roberto De Zerbi. So that's kind of a concern that I have. But in terms of the draft, I actually have no real qualms with it, right? If you think, let's say Liverpool are going to start off hot and going with that 7.5 price point, and Nkunku versus Darwin is actually an interesting matchup because if you expect Darwin to get minutes, I mean, it feels nicer to actually start with Darwin just because game week 1 and 2 you could interpret to be better if you really still expect for Chelsea to be terrible. Salah, of course, I don't think I have any issues with Salah in terms of drafts. The only issue, of course, has been how to fit him in. And actually, in the structure here, I don't really have any complaints apart from the lack of bench. My concern, of course, is when you're looking at Ndombele here, a little bit of wishful thinking, I guess, for us now to expect the 4.5 mid to be good. And when you're actually coupling that with the 4.5 forward, that makes your draft really weak. Now, if you were to, let's say, go for a 3-5-2 setup, or if you were to opt for something like a 3-4-3, I can kind of understand going for that template there because at the very minimum, you would have maybe 2 defenders, right, who could actually be bench players. In this situation, you arguably only have 1 interesting player at this point in time because, of course, some moves haven't been made. Balogun hasn't moved to a Premier League team, which I think is also still, at this moment in time, wishful thinking. So for now, I think the bench is actually slightly weaker than most drafts, even ones where you have a 3-5-2 draft where you have 2 4.0 playing defenders. In terms of Shaw and Onana, I can understand, of course, if you move towards Onana. The question, of course, would be, what would you actually go for in terms of a starting 5.0 defender? I guess the option would be to maybe look towards someone from Spurs, like a Pedro Porro, because he has been playing the recent games in the preseason. But you could also look towards maybe some cheaper Chelsea options. And I will be talking about this in the video in terms of someone like Colwell who could be interesting. That additional money could also be maybe spent on going for a 4.5 rotation setup, I suppose, because you probably won't want to call on Baldock too much. Maybe that sort of rotating 4.5 could work. I'm not a huge fan of rotating pairs, but at this point in time, just because there's not so many options in the 5.0 range, when you've already got Gabriel and Estupiñán, it's kind of hard to make a decision there. So those are my early thoughts. Or, of course, you can just simply push Ake up if you're concerned about his minutes and therefore save yourself some money there. In terms of the midfield, I don't really have any complaints. It's a very standard template midfield, and it's template for a reason. I don't think there's anything to really complain about. One thing that does concern me, of course, in terms of the structure of the team here is, let's say Darwin's a bit weak, and maybe Jesus is someone that we really wanted to have in the forward position. Is there a slight inflexibility here in terms of the budgeting, right? Because if you have not so much money in the bank and Jesus is, let's say, performing well, Arsenal's doing well, does this team have the opportunity to move into triple Arsenal so quickly? That's probably one of my questions. So for that reason, I'd probably just rate this draft a 7.5. I do think a little bit of work needs to be done in terms of the bench. I myself am not so high on Salah. we also need to see what happens to Enciso, because I think he's actually the glue holding together most good-looking Salah drafts, but potentially Enciso is a bit of a trap. But let's see, of course, based on preseason. Now, the next draft here is going to be FPL Meerkat's draft. Meerkat is also a fellow YouTuber, so feel free to check out his channel when you do have the chance. As far as the draft, it's pretty template and pretty stock standard, except for the front line once again. And you'll see here there's a recurring theme where people are actually opting to go away from Jesus and Nkunku, which seems to be template, and going for some other budget forwards. Wisa's an interesting one, right? I have to say that when you actually look at Wisa's underlying stats, even in the games where Tony's missing, yes, of course, he takes the central striker position, but what does that mean? I think you have to look at underlying stats, because that is usually a good indication of what kind of positions a player got into in those matches. And upon reviewing those matches, I don't think Wisa actually has particularly good numbers. In fact, Mbeumo still shines to me as a brilliant option, whether he plays centrally, whether he plays on wing positions, which is actually the expectation, and he'll be on penalties. So I personally would love to spend that additional 0.5 on Mbeumo. So that's just my sort of little prefacing in the beginning. As far as Wisa, look, if you want to go with Wisa, I do think you really need to call upon potentially a little bit of a stronger bench. That's one of the issues with this draft that I feel this suffers from. Bentley's interesting. I feel like Meerkat here has actually chosen all the players who actually have the potential to grow to become Premier League starters. So Semenyo is going to get more minutes. We saw that close to the end of last season. Of course, they have a new coach, and we need to kind of watch out for that as well. But Baldock and Bell, I mean, these are playing defenders, which is actually a huge benefit, right? When you look at 4.0, yes, it looks weak, but ultimately they're playing players, and you're not expecting to start these players. So the question of course, is your starting 11 going to play every week? And that's why I go back to someone like Wisa, where I'm not so sure if I'm that high on him as an option. As far as Mitoma and Martinelli, I think they're fantastic picks in terms of, is Martinelli the correct 8.0 midfielder to go for, or should you kind of downgrade into players like Foden and that? Or even just go for someone like Jesus. Personally, I'm a big fan of Jesus over Martinelli, but I can understand structurally why people have moved towards Martinelli. I guess the idea is, let's say Jesus is performing really well. Can you actually keep Jesus if you suddenly need to move towards Nkunku, and Nkunku becomes an interesting option? Maybe not. In this structure, of course, you don't really have the capacity for it, so that's one concern that I have. What if Jesus are doing well? What if Nkunku is doing well? Will you change the stream dramatically? That's two transfers, I suppose, to move towards a forward position there. So I think there's some inflexibility as well. But at the same time, you could also argue that other options will be appealing, right? If Nkunku is appealing, it's more than likely Sterling could be appealing too. So I can understand that you might want to keep this structure. So Son, same thing with him here. The only thing is, if you pivot away from Son and he's not so interesting, you're probably going to save quite a bit of money. So that's kind of one of my initial points that I would say. In that Son and Rashford position, I don't see necessarily the need to go for both options. Personally, I don't think Son is that much of an option to consider early doors, just because someone like Maddison could be a bit more interesting than Son at a much cheaper price, so why not go there? But for the rest of the draft, I think it's super powerful. I mean, the defense, this sort of template back three with Flecken is incredibly strong. I personally have been quite high on going for Onana, but when I think about Flecken and the value of 4.5 goalkeeper, as soon as we know who this Brighton starting keeper is, then he'll become an incredible option. But you've already got Flecken staring at the face here, starting for Brentford, so he's an incredible option as well. So because this defense is so strong, it also has Trent, which I actually prefer, let's say if we compare back to the previous draft, over Darwin at this point in time. Of course, we need to sort of see how Trent is going to cooperate with Szoboszlai, how Fabinho leaving the team potentially would also change things up. But for now, of course, I would actually give this draft an 8.5. Just because a lot of the key options are here. Where you've gone a little bit off the curve, I suppose, in terms of the template, in terms of Son and Wisa, is something that I don't particularly like. But at the same time, I'm really high on Son anyways, in general, in terms of going for him as a differential, whereas with Wisa, I'm not. So it balances out. So the next draft here is actually Tommy Phillips' draft, and it's actually going to be a 4-3-3 setup. And once again, the theme is, slightly weaker benches than most. And interestingly here, you've actually gone for a 4-3-3. Pretty crazy, because I think a lot of people are super high on the flexibility of the midfield positions. This actually has three midfielders. What's the main concern here? I mean, for me, I think this is an unfortunately weak draft, just because you're calling on too much from your options in terms of defense. I definitely do not want to be starting, let's say, a rotation of Sheffield United and Everton week to week. I think that's way too weak. I think you've got arguably three premiums, because I've always been arguing for Trent as a premium this season, the way he's priced. And then you've got Haaland, Kane, and Trent. Some people are already struggling to fit in, let's say, Haaland and Trent in the draft. I think you've gone a step too far, unfortunately, in terms of going for Haaland, Kane, and Trent. I think one of them has to be dropped so that the overall team can be improved in terms of balance. What I do like with the midfield, actually, is that you have these options in the 7 to 7.5 range that are really good. And actually still, there are some great options in the midfield that are still cheaper, right? We talked about how Mitoma and Boom in the past can be great options. If you're someone who's actually interested in, let's say, relying upon a weaker team like a Sheffield United from a defensive point of view, why not rely on some of the midfielders in the game that are much cheaper that I think actually provide a lot more value in terms of Mitoma or a March or a Mbumo? So that's kind of my opinion there. Saliba, I can kind of understand going for. Yes, it's differential. Ultimately, you have the same priced Arsenal player. Potentially, you think he's got more quality than Gabriel on the feet, but I mean, that doesn't really matter too much when Gabriel's obviously going to be getting the bulk of his points through attacking returns, through set pieces, with his head. But you know, we've seen Saliba do some magic last season, and he could repeat it, but I think that's not a huge issue. Stupian is a great pick as well, Flecken a great pick as well. So the issue here is just structurally between Kane and Trent, and that's sort of impinging on the draft. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to give it a 6 out of 10 because I think there's too little balance here, particularly with the defense and also having to start Baldock each week, where you just really don't need to make your team that weak. I personally think that this season it seems like a very healthy starting draft would have 11 to 12 starting players. This one I'd actually say has 10 with 2 really strong rotational players in terms of the 4.0s, but everyone is sort of opting for that when they go for a 3-back setup. So unfortunately, this draft does fall short for me. So the fourth draft here is going to be from that guy, a frequent sort of commenter on this channel, someone who actually supports. So thank you so much for sending in this draft. This is a sort of 3-5-2 template and something very similar to, I think, the first draft that I actually debuted on this channel, with exception to maybe, let's say, swapping and Kunku for Jesus was something that I think I did with one of my early drafts. I think this draft structure is fantastic. Maybe the change of Bell really just depends on what happens with this Luton fixture, but I can understand going for Botman because ultimately this is a 4.5 option for what was last year's second best defense, and you don't really have someone as great as an option game week 5 post. So as long as you can, let's say, have this team playing for you for the first 4 game weeks with no issues, then Botman becomes an elite option. And I guess for that reason, Botman is actually a very worthy keep to start your draft. And that's probably the question that everyone should be asking themselves when they actually own a 4.5 player. Do you own Botman for the purposes of having him with a long-term draft in mind, with a later wild card in mind? If that's the case, then go for Botman. Otherwise, go for some players who have some early better fixtures, just because you can't rely on Botman when he's playing City, when he's playing Liverpool. As far as Pickford and Shaw, I don't think this is particularly good. I think you can swap this up with Onana and Gabriel. First of all, do you have the option of going for triple Arsenal? And if you do, I would definitely go for that. There's no reason to ignore Arsenal. A lot of them still got some pretty, I think, very, very safe price increases when in reality they've been a top performing team. Jesus is at a ludicrous price, and obviously you've captured that here. Foden, I can understand the upside here. I would actually probably give this draft a 9.5 really, but I would just suggest changing the Onana and Gabriel aspect because I do prefer that as a 10 million pairing compared to the 5.5 of Shaw and the 4.5 of Pickford. A little bit of math for you guys here. So in terms of Shaw, for example, if you have, let's say, Shaw in his peak season just simply playing left back, because last season he was playing a mixture of left center back and left back, so therefore his stats weren't particularly good. If you have a peak Shaw season, right, an expected assists of 0.24 per 90 compared to, let's say, Gabriel's expected goals per 90 of 0.13. Gabriel's actually clear here because he is a defender who's going to get goal scoring points. Of course, Shaw can still score a goal himself, but you know his XG isn't particularly high. He is also a bit more of a traditional wing back in terms of someone who still bombards a lot of crosses into the field. But of course, we have seen his sort of proclivity to, of course, to step into the box and take shots. But I can understand why Shaw is interesting. I just think that Onana could match that sort of level. And of course, getting access to the Arsenal defense in place of the Everton defense is so much of an upgrade that I can't really speak about how much of a better option that is. And that's pretty much the only qualm I have with this draft. I think, yes, there's a little bit of problems here in terms of, okay, let's say if Foden's not a particularly good option, do you have to spend that 0.5? And are there any options below Foden that could be interesting? I guess that could be Sterling. But what would happen to this sort of triplet in your midfield of a 6.5 to 7.5 player? Is that too little budget spent on the midfield? Do you need the access to go to someone like Rashford? So what happens if Saka or Bruno need to be pushed into a Son or a Rashford? Is there enough money in the midfield? That's probably a question that's posed by Trent, if we're being honest. And I guess the simple answer is saying that Trent could match. So I can completely understand. That's in my opinion, a 50-50 choice that you have to make as a manager. And I think, as I said, this draft is very, very strong. No real issues with it. Has really good bench depth. It also lasts long in terms of the sense of what Botman can provide long term for you. So for that reason, I would give it a 9.5. And the last draft that we're going to go with is Claire's draft. So thank you so much for submitting the draft. Eze is an interesting option. This is actually one of the 6.5 options in the game where I think a lot of people have clearly dismissed it. What Claire has done here is actually gone with a very template structure, but actually gone with 2 different 6.5 picks. So instead of going for an Mbumo, we've gone for Eze and Gross. So actually we've swapped Mbumo with 2 other penalty takers, which is quite interesting. I actually think this would work quite well because my usual question mark to people, let's say, dropping Mbumo in their drafts is, I mean, why would you give up a penalty taker? And technically what you've done here is replaced him with 2 penalty takers, potentially. And of course, with Eze and Gross, we know that they're most likely going to be penalty takers. Eze's going to be back with Roy Hodgson, someone who he played 90 minutes under and was the penalty taker for. As far as Gross, this is an interesting one because he was the penalty taker under Potter. So there's no real suggestion to say that he would necessarily be the penalty taker unless we get a preseason sign. Until we really see someone take a penalty for Brighton now that McAllister has left the team. I do think Gross is a little bit of a question mark, but he has great early fixtures. And I suppose if you're banking on an early penalty, this makes sense. And you're also sidestepping some of the Mitoma March ownership. I personally still like someone who's still a little bit more active in terms of being inside the box, taking shots, getting expected goals from that point of view, as opposed to someone who is a bit more like a right wing back that Gross could be, or even a center mid potentially in the structure here, replacing McAllister, as opposed to, as I said, Mitoma and March. In terms of the defense, I think, going for a City defense actually makes this team incredibly well-rounded. It actually still incorporates Trent, surprisingly. So this is a shockingly good team. 4-4-2 is definitely, and this template specifically where you have this 2 6.5 mid structure, actually showcases, in my opinion, the amount of depth you have in FPL, particularly in that 6.5 position. Because let's say if Eze doesn't fire out immediately well, you can simply move that to Mbumo. There's no reason to say that we wouldn't go outside of triple Brighton, because also they were one of the best attacking teams in the league last season. So even in a sea of tough fixtures, having Brighton attackers isn't necessarily a bad thing. One Brighton defender isn't necessarily a bad thing either. Of course, when it's a Stupinian, I think he's non-negotiable. As far as Ake, the question, of course, is just going to be whether Guardiola comes in. And if Guardiola comes in, that could, of course, put a little bit of pressure in terms of what this team can actually create. Because at this 5.0 option, and this is something that I actually mentioned looking at Rohit's draft, thinking about it again, you could actually definitely put someone like Ake into his draft at the 5.0 position. That would actually make it very, very strong. But it really does depend on Ake being fit by game week 1 and actually ready to play and not really having to compete for game week 1 to game week 8 with someone like Guardiola. So that's something to look out for. Otherwise, I'd actually say that this draft is a very healthy 9.5 as well. Eze is probably a differential that some people disagree with, but ultimately, I don't think Crystal Palace were a necessarily poor team. Their attacking numbers did improve when Roy Hodgson came in. The question mark, I suppose, is going to be, does he have better fixtures than Brentford? I don't think so necessarily. So I do sort of like Mbumo just a bit more from that aspect. And with Gross, positionally, right, if he still plays right wing back, is it not better to maybe go with March and Mitoma? That's probably a question that I'd leave up to you. But I still have Gross as a very high option in my cheat sheet ultimately, and I think this draft is super well-rounded. A lot of people will feature Rashford on some drafts. A lot of people will feature Bruno, maybe both. I haven't really seen both as of late, but so far these drafts still look incredibly strong, as so long as you really have one of the United players. And having Trent there, of course, is always going to be that 50-50 question with Bruno as well, seemingly. So that's how things come down to it. Thank you guys so much for submitting your drafts, and I'll see you guys in the next video.